Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this episode, we're going to continue work on our global search and then move on with the styles for our global header. Let's start things off with some quick improvements to the code we've written so far. It seems like every time you step away from your code, you think of things you could have done better, or get ideas for improvements that will make the project go more smoothly. This is why it's so crucial to take frequent breaks when designing or developing a project. The first thing we can do is some quick cleanup with our skip nav link. If we look at our app.css file, and do a search here for our skip nav, and look at the focus state here, you can see that we accidentally left in a default transform, but since we already have complete coverage in our mobile and non-mobile media queries, we can just get rid of this line entirely. Give that a save here. Next, I forgot to add a role of presentation to our SVGs that we added so far. Because these SVGs are just visual aids and we already have an accessible name within our button with this hidden text of open search, for example, we actually don't need these SVGs to be available to the screen reader DOM. So we can add a role of presentation as an attribute to each of these SVG blocks. Real quick. Give that a save. And what that does is it basically avoids the need for any redundant accessible naming. Next up, I thought of a nice improvement for our focus styles that we have throughout our CSS here. We can add a default state and a nice transition which will give the sense of animating between focused elements. Let me show you what I mean by that. So using our skip nav as an example here, instead of setting the outline completely on focus, what we can do is just change the outline color, and then we'll add outline color to our transition here. As an example, let's set our outline to 0.4 rem solid, and we'll just set it to be transparent by default. We'll also want to add another transition property here, bring in our global transition timing and easing, and then we'll want to be very specific here and just say we want to transition the outline color itself. Next up, in a focus style, we can say outline color, get rid of the width and style properties for the outline itself. And if we give that a save, we won't really notice with the skip nav specifically. But if we were to apply those same styles to our nutrition brand, our button icons, and other focusable elements, you'll see that there'll be a nice animation between them. So let's continue on in our CSS file here. Let's find our brand and do the same treatment. So again, we're going to add transition property for our outline color. And then I'm just going to copy this line completely and we can move it up into our main block here. Now again, what we want to do is get rid of this variable and instead just set it to be transparent. And then down here, we want to clean up our CSS property for our focus state, getting rid of the width and style properties. All right. Moving on, let's do the same thing for our button icon, which is just below it. We can actually copy quite a bit here. So we'll grab that outline, put it on the button icon, make sure that we have a transition property for the outline color, and then clean up our focus style one more time. Give that a save. And if we were to tab between the brand and button icon now, you can see that they have a nice transition, and it almost gives the sense that the focus ring is animating between elements. This will become more apparent when we get our global header finished, and you'll see that we'll be transitioning focus between each of the top links, for example, and it just adds a nice touch for some clarity and context of where your tab focus is moving to. Real quick, let's just make sure that we've covered all of our outlines. So we'll just do a search for that. Skip nav is looking good. Brand, button icon, and that's it. So we should have everything covered with our focus styles and that nice improvement. The last thing we're going to tackle before we continue on the global header itself is adding a new type spec that's dedicated for our link styles. So when reviewing our design files and planning for the remaining work in the global header, we know that we're going to use tcopy large for these top nav links, as well as our menu that expands out to the side. But because links have a consistent hover pattern between them and also receive focus styles, it seems to make more sense to simply create a dedicated type spec called t-link instead of using t-copy-large and having to bring in another class to get the hover and focus styles. In our app.css, we're going to find our typography styles. We scroll up here, and it would probably make sense to pair this with t-copy-large just because it's so similar in its properties. So we can actually grab this whole block, copy it down, and we're just going to call it t-link. Now all of these properties will stay the same. The only thing that's going to change is we're going to add in an explicit color, set it to our default charcoal. Next up, we're going to add a transition. First off, for our color. So bring in our transition variable, color. And then another thing we're going to do is also transition the outline like we just did above. So this would be with outline color because we're going to add a focus style here. Moving on to our hover styles for our links. As we talked about before, we want everything that's the primary gray to hover to that secondary gray. So on hover, we're going to update this to charcoal 46. And last up, we need to get our focus styles in. And we'll set the outline color to be the color slate blue. And that reminds me that we need to set a default outline above. So let's set our outline 0.4 rems, solid, and in this case would be transparent actually. Clean up my file here. And then we only update the outline color again on focus, get our outline offset going, which will be 0.2 rems. And now we'll have this nice type spec for links, which will save us a lot of time and a lot of redundant work if we were adopting copy large. So with things like component classes or type spec classes, it's good to kind of play it by ear to see when it's good to encapsulate styles and when it's good to stick to more of a utility approach. So for most of these type specs, it makes sense instead of having to repeat all of our typography properties per component to just bring in this type spec class and then supply another custom BIM class on top of that. But sometimes for things like links, you can think of them as basically a standalone component. And so it'll save us a lot of time by just styling links explicitly with this class and not having to make a component specific selector for each of their use cases, like the top nav, the side menu, and so forth. All right, so with that out of the way, let's shift our attention back to the global header search that we were building in the last episode. And so if you recall, we were starting on the mobile first design here, and we can set it up in our HTML file so we can preview it in our browser here. Let's pull up Inspector Tools while we're at it. We'll switch to responsive design mode. And this is again our 320 by 480 breakpoint. In our HTML file, let's go down to our search and add the modifier class search is open. Give that a save, and now we can preview where we left off last time. So the first improvement or thing that we'd like to add from here is addressing the right padding of the text input itself. So if we were to type a long search, I'm just going to type some gibberish here. You can see that it goes underneath the search icon. And that's because our search icon is positioned absolutely to the right of this input, and the input spans the full width. So a quick fix for this is to add some right padding to the input itself, and that'll make sure that the search text is never obscured by the search submit button. In our app.css, let's find our search input class. Great. Now in our search input, we just want to add a padding right of 4.8 rems, and this is the dimension of the submit button itself. Let's see if this works out for us. So if we save that, we can tell that it's no longer obscured. One thing I'm noticing here is if you were trying to select the very end of your text, you might accidentally click the submit button. So just to hedge our bets against that, let's actually bump this up to 6.4 rem. All right, so with that bumped up, now we have good clearance for selecting our text without accidentally submitting the search itself. And we know that it'll never overlap, so that's a nice little improvement there. Let's reference our design to see what else we need to add for the mobile open state here. We don't have our focus style showing by default, so let's drill down into our layers here in Figma. Go into our header content. The center of it, we have our search form. And if we expand our layers a little bit here just to see what we're working with, it looks like we have an empty version. So if we toggle that off, we should see our focused version. Now, one thing it looks like we forgot to do was increase the thickness of the bottom border when the search input is active. And it looks like we also have a little bit of left padding on the input itself. So we can make those two quick improvements here just to get our mobile version tuned up nicely. In our design, let's find the interior text and see what the spacing is. It looks like we only have 8 pixels left padding. Let's get that added real quick. Padding left is 0.8 rems, and I'm actually going to move this down to the next line so that way it follows top, right, bottom, left in terms of explicit padding and margin values. Give that a save. That's looking correct over there. And you can tell right now when our search input is focused or active or has content inside of it that the bottom border is only 2 pixels right now. So let's scroll down to our focus styles in our CSS. And in addition to updating the border bottom color, we want to set the border width to be 0.4 rems instead. So we can see this kind of awkward jump when we increase the bottom border size. And that's because the interior dimensions of the input has changed. We've increased the border, and so that's pushing the input up. So to counteract that, we might have to get creative here. And when the search input is focused, we might actually have to translate it down. It looks like by 1 pixel because it would be half the added height of 2 pixels here. Let's give that a try and see if that solves our situation here. So in focus, we're going to transform and we're going to translate in the Y direction just by 0.1 rem. Let's see if this solves it for us. Okay, so you can see that because it was pushing it up 1 pixel before, if we translate down on focus, now everything is holding steady and that looks great. All right, so our mobile open search state is looking really nice and clean, both for the empty and active states. And if we were to continue on with the responsive styles at this point, we have it just set to be width 100, but there's going to be a lot of considerations for the layout of the global search in its open state on desktop in reference to how it interacts with the top navigation links and also the responsive layout at various breakpoints. So because we don't have a ton of that context to work off right now, we're actually going to pause work on the global search. And instead, we're going to complete more of the global header first. This will give us a better idea of the surrounding elements and layouts so we can finish the open state at all breakpoints. And it's a great example of how UX development is a very iterative process. It's sometimes best to go back and forth between components as it becomes more clear how things will interact. So throughout this whole process, it's critical to have the patience to do things right, and also to step away from certain tasks until we're ready to have everything finalized. With that in mind, it seems like the next most helpful thing that we could do is to finish building out the remaining elements of our global header. We're going to still have a mobile first mentality. And if you look at our mobile design here, the remaining element that we need to add when the search is closed is our menu button. And we might go through and focus on the desktop styles for these always visible elements first, before we worry about getting the search open state finalized for desktop or the menu open state itself. Taking a look at our HTML real quick, we know that on mobile, if we remove our open state before we dive into this, just to check. All right, that's looking good now. We know that we want to hide the center navigation links on mobile and instead only show the brand, search open icon button, and the menu button itself. So by default, our form is hidden, which takes care of that. I'm just going to collapse that out of the way for now. We put this temporary screen reader only class on our nav as a whole. And these 4 links represent the center navigation on desktop in the global header, followed by the menu button and the menu contents itself. Now, as I mentioned back in the first episode that we worked on HTML in, I wasn't sure if we were going to be able to stick with the nav wrapping the entirety of the center nav links as well as this menu. It's important to not use too many landmark HTML elements. And landmark elements are things like main or article. They denote certain semantic areas of your content. And as landmarks, it's good to not have too many landmarks presented to screen reader users because that kind of dilutes their value in bringing attention to critical areas of the page. But in this case, really we do have kind of 2 distinct navigation patterns. So it might make sense for styling purposes, but also a little bit of a semantic or structural improvement to instead close out the nav for these center links and then create a new nav instead of using this div here around our actual menu itself. So let's make sure we refactor this div and instead put a nav element in and find our closing div here and correct that as well. And lastly, get rid of this closing nav that was originally surrounding everything and fix up our indentation. So we can outdent the menu button and the nav. Now what we can do is if we were to save this, obviously we're showing everything at once. So we'll want to establish some initial states for both the center navigation links as well as the menu. Now this first nav, let's give it a class of center nav, let's say. We can always change this in the future. And the secondary nav is our menu. So we'll just keep the naming nice and clean there. And one last thing at this stage is we know for desktop, we're going to need to group the search as well as the center links for layout purposes. And because we have a dedicated nav for the centered links, we can wrap the open button as well as the center nav in a div. And let's just call this div header center as part of the header component. Grab all of our contents that'll go inside there, make sure they're nested neatly, give that a save. And that's a lot closer to the final structure that we'll need for finishing out the styling here. Now that we have our HTML tuned up a little more, and we gave some dedicated class names to the center navigation or menu, let's go ahead and hide those by default. We'll continue on making new sections. We'll have a section comment for the center nav, bring in the class name we just created. And this will actually be inside of a media query because at a max width of 575 pixels, this is just our guess at that mobile breakpoint again. We might change this in the future. We want to display none these links entirely. And the reason why we're using display none here instead of simply hiding them visually like we've done for screen reader content is because these links will actually be replicated in the global menu on mobile. And so it'd be redundant to make them available to the screen reader DOM in both cases. All right, so let's hide our menu by default. Now our menu is going to be both for desktop and mobile, but by default it'd be hidden and then receive a modifier class for its open state. So by default, we can just say it's display none. And then once we get into styling the open states across all breakpoints, we'll do that with a modifier class. Taking a look at our mockup, we're at our live preview now. We just have our menu button, which we can focus on styling at this point. So let's get our reference back up here. So the menu button, looking at it real quick, should basically match a similar pattern to our button icon. But our button icon styles didn't necessarily accommodate buttons with text just yet. So instead of repeating ourselves quite a bit with the hover and focus patterns that we want to use on any button that contains an icon, let's adapt our button icon class to work well with the menu button. And then from there, if we have any specific needs for this particular layout, we can just add another BIM class on top of that to provide any custom properties that we'll need for this use case. Let's move up to our button icon real quick and bring it into view. So looking at our button icon, everything that we see here, we actually want on our menu button. The only thing that I think we're missing is to set color styles for our typography. So by default, this wouldn't affect anything if we already hid the actual button text. But if we do show button text, we can have these properties target that so that everything is nice and consistent with our interaction patterns. And we'll also want to add the color with our variable again as a transition property. Let me get our color specified there, make sure our formatting is correct. And then on hover, we will want to set the color to be that lighter gray. And I think that takes care of it. Let me rearrange my color properties to come before my decorative properties, just a preference. And now I think if we apply button icon to our menu button here, this should give us a good start. So we have a class of button icon. And let's expand this out because we know we'll bring in our SVG below this. Let's go ahead and put a span of tcopy large around our menu text and repeat that in here. And lastly, let's take a look at our files. Let's go into our assets, our icons. And one unique thing about this particular icon button is we'll have a different icon depending on if it's mobile or desktop. So we have menu small for our mobile view. We can close our global find here. And we'll inline our SVG as usual. A couple things here. We want to give it a class of button icon __ icon. And then let's not forget to do our role of presentation because it doesn't need to be accessible to screen readers. It's just a visual aid. If we give that a quick save, we should see it shaping up pretty much how we want it, actually. And if we were to tab over to it, we're getting really close to finishing this out. A couple things we'll need to do is to add an additional class to the icon itself because we're going to need to show and hide this depending on breakpoint. So let's say that this is the menu icon small, and then we'll want to bring in our regular icon menu, paste that in directly after, and match the implementation pretty closely. So it can receive the same button icon element class. And then we'll say that this menu icon is going to be the large variation. Next up, let's add role presentation one last time. By default, both of these will show, and you can see that that doesn't look how we want it to. But we'll take care of that with CSS in just a second here. While we're at it, I think our naming here could be a little bit better. So instead of just menu icon, I think we'll want to call this the menu trigger since we do have a menu block directly below. And let's go ahead and add that as a block class to our button itself. Give that a save. And now in our CSS, if we go all the way to the bottom of our file, it'll come before our menu, but we can start working on this menu trigger and its associated icons. So the first thing is on mobile, what we'll want to do is hide our large icon and then do the opposite for desktop. So at a max width of 575 pixels, we'll want to target our menu trigger icon large as a modifier class and set this to be displayed none. All right, so that's looking more like we want it. Now, if we reference our design just to see how we're coming along, we have a margin between the icon and menu. I think this changes depending on breakpoint. So let's inspect the small variation here real quick. And if we drill down into our files, the icon, the gap between them is 8 pixels. So let's say that for a max width of 575 pixels, our menu trigger icon small will have a margin left of our space half value, which is equivalent to 8 pixels. Now, because these are the exact same media query, we can actually move this down into this block, get rid of that unnecessary media query, give that a save. Everything should now be looking good. Let's make sure we have a space between our classes here just to keep things nice and tidy. And let's give it a quick visual check if we tab onto it. It's looking good. One thing I notice is we seem to have a browser default style for this inner focus state. I think that's coming from Firefox. And we may want to address the outline offset on button icons in general, just so it's not jammed up right next to the contents of the button. Okay, so going back to our button icon, since we're inheriting styles from this, before our focus styles, let's target a Mozilla specific property directly to get rid of that inner focus that we were seeing with that dotted line. So button icon, we'll use the pseudo selector syntax, Moz focus inner, and let's say that the border is 0, or in this case, we can actually just say none. Those should be equivalent. Let's double check that though. So if we tab back up, I don't see that dotted border anymore, which is looking a lot better. While we're up here, we want to set the outline offset. Instead of setting it to negative 0.2 rems, let's make sure that's positive, but we'll want that to reside on the main block so that way we're not animating the offset itself. Give that a save. And you can kind of see our animation that we added earlier is really nice in this use case. It kind of looks like the focus ring is animating between elements because it's fading in and out nice and neat between them. That outline offset reminded me that we might want to check our other blocks that we refactored the focus styles on. So let's just go ahead and give that a quick search. Yep, and you can see on our brand, we actually need to move that up as well, which will clean things up. Let's double check our other blocks here. Same thing on T-Link. And lastly, our skip nav. It'd be good to just have that ready to go. All right, so that's just a quick little improvement to our focus styles once more. Now everything is animating nicely between them. All right, let's take a look at our menu button once more. The hover pattern is looking correct. The focus styles are looking good. Maybe what we can do real quick is start thinking about how these various elements in the global header will behave responsively for a larger breakpoint. So with our menu here, let's take a look if we go into our layers once more. Grab this icon. It looks like the margin between them will be 16 pixels, and obviously we're going to trade out the icon itself. In our CSS, let's go down to menu trigger and create a new breakpoint for above mobile. I'll say 576. We might adjust these as we go. We're going to basically want to do the opposite of what we see here in our mobile first media query. So we'll basically move these lines into separate blocks. And then as I mentioned, instead of space half, this will be space default with icon large. Let's give that a check using responsive design mode. Cool. So above 575 pixels, the full menu button is there. Our hover pattern looks good. Focus style should work as expected. And I think all that's left for the global header kind of core elements is to basically style the center nav now. So while we're here, we can focus on the center area, get this polished up, and then we might be able to finalize the remaining breakpoints for the global search itself. Let's shift our focus back to our center nav. One thing I noticed in our app.css is we have an empty selector here. Let's just cut that out for now. We can always bring it back if we need specific styles on the menu trigger. I think we might be good in this case. And in our index.html, we have center nav. Let's go ahead and finalize the markup and class names for these links. Now, one thing I might start with is you'll notice a gap between each of the links being inline elements here. And that's actually caused by having a break in the code in our file. So if we were to take those line breaks out, you'll notice that the gap goes away, but I really don't like the formatting that we see here. So one thing we can do that actually adds a little bit of semantic value is instead put these inside an unordered list. So we'll have an unordered list with 4 list items. Get that expanded out. Let's hold Control and Alt or Command and Option and the arrow keys to do multi-cursor selection. We're going to hit the home key while holding shift to copy all these, cut them, move our cursors up into our list items, paste those in. Let's get our formatting the way we want it. So if we go and create line breaks, everything's nested neatly. And while we're at it, we can give class names to each of these elements. So these will be called center nav item for each of these. We know that all of our links are going to have a class of t-link as their typography spec, which also gives the hover and focus styles. Looks like I have a small typo here. And then the list itself, I like using the plural parent pattern. So each of these items is center nav item. And I like to say that we have center nav items as the parent, as kind of a collection of these singular items. All right, that's looking good. We have all of our class names that we'll need for styling. Get rid of our extra line breaks there. Scroll down, we have our center nav up here. The first thing we need to address is the overall layout between the search trigger button and these links. If you look, we added that div with a header center class. So let's go ahead and target that directly. Let's say this is display flex. See where we're at with that. Okay, what we want to do is make sure that the items are align items center. That's looking good. Let's start working on the links themselves. So on that unordered list, we had a class of center nav items, I believe. And we'll want to set their display to be flex as well. Looking good. We're going to have to target each individual item. Let me make sure that's singular. What we want to do is take off the list style so we don't get the bullet point there. And let's inspect this real quick just to make sure we're doing well. Okay, it looks like we have some default margins and padding coming from the UL. Let's make sure we reset those. So we'll say margin is going to be 0 as a start, and padding will be 0 as well. Save that. That's looking much cleaner. Let's reference our design to see what the spacing between these items is going to be. So between our links, it looks like we have 48 pixels specified. That's not necessarily a spacing value that we have elsewhere in our designs, other than tap target sizes. So for spacing values, let's instead see if we can get away with 32 pixels and if that's enough spacing. So in each item, we're going to want to target everything but the first item here. So we'll say nav item, and we'll use the not selector to say not the first child. So basically the second and onward items should have a margin left on them. And that margin left, as we talked about, let's try out the space double value. Give that a save. That's probably plenty of spacing on these. It looks like already, based on what we have between our links and the search button, that we probably won't have enough room to really show the links at this breakpoint. So instead of showing them at 575, let's go up to the next logical breakpoint as a good guess. And let's say 786 and see how that feels. Okay, so they're still hidden now. If we go up a little bit further, now they're appearing. We might be able to get away with some spacing between the search open button and the rest of these links. So for a wide desktop right now, between these items, we have 128 pixels, or that space oct value that we use elsewhere. That still seems like a lot here, so we might want to add another breakpoint to conditionally pad it depending on viewport. So let's create a media query here for our center nav items. And let's say media. We know that we're going to start spacing them above 786. So let's say min width is going to be 787 pixels. We'll want to target this class name here, paste that in, open that block. Let's say the margin left in this case is going to be space quad. I think we'll start with that, 64 pixel equivalent. See how that feels. Yep, so there's plenty of room. Let's bring it down to our breakpoint where it goes away. So that looks like pretty comfortable spacing between the elements there. I'm liking that a lot. Okay, so now that we know it works well for our breakpoint we've established as a baseline, let's see at what point we want to bring in that increased padding. So probably somewhere around, let's say 1200 pixels, we could afford to add another 64 pixels of margin between these elements. Let's add a media query here and say min width of 1200 pixels and copy the same block out and instead increase this to be space oct, and that'll get us up to the spacing that we wanted in our original desktop design here. One thing I'm noticing is that we need to encapsulate these styles so there's no overrides going. So we'll want to add another condition to our media query and say and a max width of 1199 pixels, and that way there's no overrides or overlap in the styles. Let's give this a quick visual check. Everything's looking pretty good in terms of when we introduce items and the spacing between them. The last thing we need to add, now that we're looking at the header as a whole, is our padding values around it and the height of the header itself. So on desktop again, we know that we have 128 pixels left and right padding at this large breakpoint. That might be quite a bit, so we might follow the same pattern of targeting a little bit of a tablet breakpoint and starting to bring in more and more padding as we need. So let's find our header real quick, and I think we'll actually want to increase this breakpoint up to around 1024, somewhat of a tablet breakpoint for the default padding that we set here. If we give that a save, I think that should be enough padding provided to the header up to that amount. Beyond that, we'll want to increase to match the mockup that we see where we have 120 pixels on the left and right, as well as increasing the overall height of the header. So let's add another breakpoint. We can copy this out because we'll be modifying a lot of the same properties. Paste that in. Let's say this is at a min width of 1025 pixels. The padding values will be updated to be the space oct for 128 pixel equivalent, and the min height will actually be updated to space oct as well. Give that a save. Let's see how this looks. If we go beyond that breakpoint, now we should have plenty of room in our header, and it matches the design for desktop. In the next episode, we're going to finalize our global search for the desktop breakpoints with the open state to make sure that it aligns with the mockup that we have over here. If we look at this open search form, and we'll also focus on building out the open menu for both desktop and mobile.